But first and foremost, as was already announced, I'm Farrah Warner. I'm the director of climate at the Solutions Journalism Network. And I'd love for my guest panelists to just tell us who you are and where you come from.
My name is Isa Röbauer, and I'm from Germany, and I'm the head of journalism training at the Bonn Institute.
My name is Dana Regev. I'm a senior editor at the social media department of Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcaster.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joy Lee. I'm the head of editorial at an impact-driven media company called Earthrise Studio, which is based in London.
Great. All right. And there's everybody's names and who they are, so you can take a photo of that. Just waiting for that, Dana. Awesome. All right. So I'm just going to frame a few things before we get started and let you know how we're going to run this panel. We're going to start off, each one of us sort of centering ourselves for you about the work that we do and sort of where we come philosophically. And as we move, we're actually going to move from sort of theoretical, which is where Lisa and I sort of sit, conceptual, philosophical, to Joy in sort of the creation of content. And then we'll end with Dana really around amplification, because her world is really social and how does this work get out into the world. This quote for me came up when I was working with a newsroom called Nueve Millones out of Puerto Rico. And the team there is a 3-person female-led team that's really focused on how do we engage with communities around solutions or response-driven journalism. And I love this because there are some key words here. We're going to talk about hope today. We're going to talk about moving from apathy to agency. But there's an important word in here, and that's critical hope or constructive hope. This isn't a panel about good news. It's not a panel about puff pieces. It's not a panel about net zero promises and pledges, because now we all know how to break those down and tell it like it is. But I also like this is that it brings us back to the fact that we are humans, we are animals on this planet, and we share this planet with other beings. And so just like a fish needs unpolluted water, humans need critical hope. And I love this quote as a way of thinking about it. So for us at Solutions Journalism Network, we've really been thinking about the theory of change in journalism, which is the traditional theory of change is if we just keep telling people how bad it is and showing people who are going through bad things, something will happen. What that thing is, we don't know. Our responsibility for the doom and the gloom and the unsolvable and apocalyptic is not our responsibility. We just put out the news, right? That's all we're here to do. But what we're finding is that that traditional theory of change gives us exactly what we don't want, and that is apathy. It's not just news avoidance, it's apathy. And in psychology, apathy is not caring. It is not about, I don't care. It's, I care too much. I can't do this any longer. And so often what we think as journalists is that if we show a person struggling, in climate, it's usually a person of color, in water, a flood, a fire, and everything is bad around them, that somehow that will equate to empathy. But what really happens is you do that person struggling and everything bad is all over, is we, in behavioral science, we elicit a sense of pity. And pity brings a feeling that is a burden to me. So doing this is actually making our journalism, sort of making us feel pity for someone, not feel empathy. But the research, according to the research that we have, and I've put the research down at the bottom, is that one of the most likely predictors of pro-social behavior is the following, is showing a sense that everyone has contributed and received their fair share, is a stronger predictor toward pro-social, I will help you, you will help me, than whether we have common goals or we have cultural understanding. So if we can show people through these frames people with agency, not just the sum of their problems. We can use restorative justice techniques. Who are they aside from problems? Are they a parent? Are they an athlete? We can use training like asset framing, which is to frame around contributions, goals, and aspirations instead of deficit frames, which we often see in a lot of the unsolvable apocalyptic climate work. And importantly, we can move to strengths-based narratives like what organizations like A Picture's Worth do, where the community's stories are told in their way. The camera is given to the community. It's not through our frame of journalism. So that's sort of where we sit, at least within solutions journalism. And now and so thinking about what is your theory of change in journalism? What do you think your journalism does? Is it supposed to have an impact? What's the follow-on and what's your responsibility to that? Is something I'd like you to keep in mind as we talk. And now I'm going to move to Lisa.
Thank you very much for starting us off here, Farah. So what we do at the Bond Institute is that we really think of how can we center the audience, the people in our journalism. And much like the Solutions Journalism Network does, we work with newsrooms, we train them, we explore how we can do the reporting in very concrete and practical projects together. And the kind of journalism that we're doing is what we call constructive journalism. And constructive journalism is basically solutions journalism plus. So it doesn't only mean that we look at solutions focus, it's one of the things, especially in climate reporting, but it also means that we need to be rich in perspectives. We really need to think about whose voices have not been heard in our reporting so far, and that can look different for every newsroom. And it also means that we want to foster constructive dialogues on important issues of our time. And in total, that sums up that we want to work with newsrooms on how to meet people's information needs. Because when we want to stay relevant in journalism, we really need to become more human-friendly. And that's the term we prefer to use instead of saying user-centric. And that is definitely true, not only for, it's true for all sorts of reporting, but especially when we think about how to approach climate reporting, we cannot continue the way we're doing so far by only looking at the problems. We also need to give, as Farah said earlier, people something to work with, to hope for. And so to kind of sum up what I said earlier, is we see three ways to approach that. We do need to continue, report, and uncover the problems we have in relation to the climate crisis. We definitely have to do that, and we have to do that in a very rigorous way. But we cannot stop there. We also have to broaden our scope as journalists and look for solutions that are out there and report on who is doing it better already. What can we learn from others? What could work somewhere else that could also work the place I'm reporting from? And the interesting part is that this is not only hopeful for the audience that there are ways to solve this, but it's also a way to be really critical and hold people in power to account, because we can say, okay, there are people who found a way to manage this issue. Why are we not doing this? And the other aspect is to hold still when you do your reporting and ask and reflect yourself, what now? Who else is missing? We launched a series at the Bond Institute a couple of months ago, together actually with a Portuguese journalist and psychologist, Margarida Alpuim, who is still over there, and we publish it in German and English, and it's on how psychology needs to be part of the journalistic work we're doing, and I can only recommend looking on the Bond Institute side for the series and to kind of reflect the work we're doing. And lastly, we don't think you can only learn, for example, from psychology, but what we also do at the Bond Institute is that we learn from mediators, for example, and that means that we learn how to ask better questions, how to ask questions that do not only, for example, pit people against each other, because we will have a lot of discussions in the future of how we can solve or mitigate problems. So we need to bring society closer together to actually do that. And to kind of sum that up, it's a quote by a German philosopher, and it says, "A conversation requires that the other one could be right." And that is also something that journalists should take to heart when we report on stories and when we meet together with people, that we are very open-minded when we approach these stories, and that the story actually might be completely different from what we expected in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, well, that was in my face, my own face. So now we're going to move to Joy, and Joy is going to take her own clicker. Joy.
Hello. I just want to give kind of a brief introduction to Earthrise, as I reckon probably many of you might not have heard of us before. We are small, we're a startup, just to kind of give context to when we began. We started in the pandemic in a very particular social environment where there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of social anxiety. This is also the time of Black Lives Matter in the US, kind of rising, kind of understanding of climate change. So Earthrise was started by we're a group of journalists, photojournalists, filmmakers, and creatives with the sole purpose of trying to figure out how do we communicate the climate crisis to a young and global audience. I want to just show you a little bit of what we do, because I think that might be the easiest. I think if I click to the next slide. Yes, if you could press play. Fingers crossed.
That picture over there.
At the second Indigenous Women's Month.
One of the big problems that we face today is the number of people who have no connection with the natural world. People need to know we are part of the natural world. We actually aren't separated from it.
And that's why storytelling is important.
Thought to do something about it now.
Not in 2035, but now.
If you can't hear us, we shall a little louder.
The aim of this project is to create a film that captures the voices of everyone that sits in this chair. Rising.
Climate change authority explain what their flow. This COP stands for COP
in terms of where oil and gas.
Our planet right now is running out of water.
People who did the least damage to the environment are paying for it the most.
For anyone in this room, what would be the first three things that we could do?
Visibilizar el trabajo de la Amazonía.
Explain in genetic in Gaza with about 60 seconds and why they matter.
Textiles are fundamental to every culture in the world and fundamental to life for all of us.
Hope isn't just sitting back, wishful thinking. Hope depends on our action.
I always find it so interesting to watch this in a room full of journalists. I do come from a journalist background. I have been part of traditional media organizations. And what was so interesting to pivot into a space like Earthrise was a very kind of clear decision process of we do want to be able to engage a young audience and meet them where they're at and speak to them in a language that matters. So you'll notice here we use the language of storytelling and not journalism. I forgot I have the clicker. Nope. So one of the quotes that has always been kind of a North Star for us is this quote by Amitav Ghosh, a writer and critical thinker: "Climate change is a crisis of culture and thus of imagination." I think this speaks a lot to the kind of challenges that we've seen in the coverage of climate change in journalism and the larger media landscape over the last few decades, where at large part of it has always been it has been framed in the terms of this kind of abstract, far away, scientific thing that feels really intangible and quite distant from our own lived experiences. Whereas, I think we're starting to see a shift in public opinion that climate change is deeply embedded into our very social fabric, the way modern society has been shaped, and the kind of perhaps also value systems that need to be called into question or need to be put up to a more critical spotlight. And, when we're talking here about where we've gone wrong when it comes to climate storytelling, climate journalism, and how it's been covered, I tend to rely on this metaphor quite a bit of the 5 stages of grief. I think there's something quite interesting about this idea where, this process of grieving that you go through when you experience a loss of a loved one. And if you contrast that to the feeling of loss that you might have, understanding the climate crisis and what's happening in the natural world and around us. So the 5 stages, I think everyone here, when we think about the audience that we're speaking to, everyone is on a different stage of their own journey in understanding the climate crisis and how that impacts their daily lives. We've seen climate denial. That has been a huge part of the larger discourse for many, many decades. We've seen anger as a process of this, the Greta Thunberg standing up to the UN conferences, the kind of language of enough is enough. We've seen the bargaining, net zero, greenwashing, how do we continue business as usual? We've seen depression, we've seen skyrocketing rates of mental health issues that are associated to anxiety over the climate crisis. And we've also seen acceptance. And I think that a large part of this acceptance and the way that it's manifested in climate coverage has been very much around a doom and gloom narrative, a phrase that I'm sure you guys have become quite familiar with. Particularly, I think in the last few months, the last year, we've been speaking about how to move away from this doom and gloom narrative. So while everyone is on different stages of their kind of journey, and it's important to meet them where they're at, it is kind of interesting to think that we have also, just in general, shifted away from a conversation of denial and more into a conversation of, okay, now we know what the problem is, right? It's not enough to simply sound the alarm anymore. Now it's how do we move them and point them towards a fire exit? To that point of denialism, there was a study last year that was published that surveyed 17 different countries, and over 70% of people felt that climate change was a concern. So there is a growing sense of awareness, which I think is really, really, really important to note. But now that we have come to this point of doomism, this study was published also last year by The Lancet, surveyed 10,000 young people in 10 different countries around the world. Over half of them, in relation to climate change, said that they felt humanity is doomed. Over, I think, 75% of them felt that the future is frightening. And I think, again, that also kind of speaks to some of the failures that we have also experienced here in our newsrooms and in the media of how do we make sure that we're portraying this current moment in time while also providing space to think about how do we move forward and how do we also spotlight that change is possible, that there are solutions out there. And I think one thing that has been really, really important to also kind of understand is that we are not alone. Another study that has been published just a few months ago, I believe. This is very American-centric, and I would be very curious to see what this looks like in other places around the world, but has shown that the majority of Americans completely underestimate how much other people also support climate policies. So there's a sense of this idea that, yes, we have this anxiety or we have these concerns, but we are alone, that other people are also not feeling this. I think that is a very telling statement, but I also think that is also a really huge opportunity when it comes to the way that we think about how to cover the climate crisis, is also to understand that things are changing, things are developing, and that people have an appetite for these stories and have an appetite to understand more solutions. So then, if we look back at the 5 stages of grief, then how do we move forward from this paralysis, and how do we move forward from this layers of acceptance and doomism? Well, we think imagination. In other words, looking at different solutions, looking at different possible alternative visions for the future. And that can only be done, as Lisa was mentioning, by diversity of perspectives, making sure that we're spotlighting as many different, perspectives from around the world as possible, and dancing that very, very fine line between showing solutions, but also making sure to root it in reality, and that, of course, this is still a problem, and we can't go too far in, suffocating ourselves with optimism. I think it's a very delicate balance to have.
Thank you, Joy. Now we're going to move to the best slide ever. And Dana, so you're going to take us home, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation up here, and then we'll open it up for questions. Dana.
Okay, yeah, a couple of caveats. First of all, I'm far too short to lean back, so I'm going to have to sit in this very impolite manner. You'll have to excuse me. And the second thing is that I have to steal 1 minute of your time to talk about the elephant in my room, which is, I've introduced myself beforehand. One of my biggest dreams is to enter a room full of friends or people I know, or an audience like this, and say something along the lines of, I hope I'm not offending anyone here in the audience, but like something along the lines of, hey, my name is Dana Regev and I'm from Luxembourg or Andorra, I don't know, some place that doesn't trigger any major feelings. But unfortunately for me, that's not the case. My name is Dana Regev and I'm from Israel. Much for my pain and sorrow. And so since I see that a lot of people, I don't want to say falling asleep, but let's call it very heavily blinking, I'm gonna have a little tiny little questionnaire, like a little poll. You don't have to tell me what it is, or to your neighbor what it is, but raise your hand if you do not have an opinion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 1. Okay. That's what I meant by, I wish I could one day say that I'm from, I don't know, somewhere, Andorra. So towards the end of this minute, I just would like to offer my sincere condolences to people who are either affected from the Israeli side, or sadly, truly sadly, from the Palestinian side, that would probably going to be affected even further. If you want to talk about this later in the coffee break, or just if you want to get a hug, I'm here. I know that I'm personally affected, so I'm a bit out of focus. But yeah, hence my emoji. So what actually happens after, I'm going to be a bit sarcastic about it. So Lisa was giving all her training to the journalists, and they now know that they have to think about this and about that. And then others are creating this content and interviewing people and giving them the authority and I don't know what. And then comes your social media community manager, editor, whatever you want to call it, in this case, myself, and actually have to put it out somehow on the platforms, right? Because if you produce something, be it like print, online, video, anything, any piece that you worked super hard on, and it stays on your computer, then I guess this doesn't really mean much apart from you being probably very proud of it. So it has to go out somewhere, right? And that's where, at least on the solution journalism front at DW, where I work, we are trying to walk a very dangerous line between everything is poo, as opposed to, I'm not entirely sure if you can see the bottom line here, But we also, yeah, so I thought, but we also do not actually want to give people the impression that there's always a way out. And if we just collect a bit of trash from the ocean, then we can just keep throwing trash into it again because this works. So yeah, what we try to do, or what I try to do as I'm not in charge of all our social media platform. I'm spearheading Twitter and Facebook along with my colleagues who do Instagram and YouTube, and my team is going to launch WhatsApp channels, already launched Threads, and Telegram soon. So feel free to follow. You again probably can't see it, so you'll have to believe me that it's there. We're taking the approach which I call like the 3 C's, okay? Curation, context, and course, as in course of action. I'm not fooling myself that I'm tall enough to really hide something from you, but maybe the sofa. So what do we mean by that? How do we create and actually share successfully climate-related content without despairing users? That was at least a very important goal for us because, like I said, on the one hand, and as was explained very nicely here, it's not very efficient if we just tell people that everything is crap, pardon my French, and that they have nothing to do about it, because then, yeah, well, really, why should we consume content at all? And why do we even have to think about climate change? Because there's nothing we can do. But on the other hand, we don't want to be too optimistic and pretend as if there's a solution to everything. And that thing is what we take into account already, if you're a journalist, if you're an editor, if you're a social media editor, at the curation stage. So we already think about solution-oriented option when we brainstorm the idea or the pitch of what we want to report about. This doesn't mean that we totally reject anything that doesn't have a solution at all. It just means that the potential solution is always in our mind when we try to pitch and work on social media stories that are social media, again, oriented. I'm lucky enough to work at the department when we create social content first. So it doesn't have to go online. It doesn't have to go anywhere else. It's solely produced for social media. Then I would say our hardest part, at least, is the context part. And what I wrote to you, that all worthy content deserves context, is basically pretty much what I tried to tell you before, that avoiding the doom and gloom, but also remain cautious about not portraying things in a too rosy way. One good example, because you probably want concrete examples, that we've had is that we have an extremely, extremely successful video during the pandemic time from Spain, which is one of our best performing videos ever, which really showed, yeah, obviously gloomy numbers and not necessarily the nicest news about Corona, but it also presented a solution that the Spanish government had decided upon, and people were so optimistic about it. And so you don't always have to offer what I will reach in the third point and then finish. You don't even have to always offer a potential future exit path or a solution. Sometimes it's enough that we also cover, an existing solution that was taken by government, by a small group, NGO, an individual, to show people that, okay, wait, if that person did it, then maybe so can we. Which brings me to the last thing, and that is the course of potential action. If there is an exit path, guide users to it. This is what we try to do, not only in the content, but in the content-wise, but really the teasers, the hashtag, the mentions, in every way we pack our social content, our social package, we try to bear in mind, and we try to have this, okay, wait, there is an exit path here, so maybe this is something that we can show. Pretty much what Lisa is teaching at the very beginning. And that becomes increasingly important if users, followers, whatever you want to call them, are not aware, they don't know, they don't think about the solution themselves, because maybe it doesn't exist in their community, maybe they have no idea that somebody else is already doing it, or maybe they just want to be inspired by other groups or individuals that have found solutions to it in different ways. So yeah, that's a lot to think about before you hit tweet or post or whatnot, but this is nevertheless something that me and my team are trying to do at DW, and I think I will move it to Farah.
Now we're going to ask each other some questions, I think. And I'm sure Joe is going to give me a signal. I don't know where he is. He's back there. I got the thumbs up, so we're just going to take the stage for the rest of not the rest of the day. So I'm going to leave this up, but one of the things I was thinking while you were all talking was something that Cristiana Figueres said at a conference I was at recently. He used to be with the UN. And it goes to the question I'm going to ask, which is, I'll give it to you and you can think for a minute. Why is critical hope important now? Cristiana Figueres said that the actions that we take in this decade, and we're already in 2023, so we've got 7 years, are going to be absolutely critical for the health of the earth for the next hundreds or thousands of years. So actions that we take in this decade are critical. So if we aren't pointing out the actions and the responses that are being taken and exposing those to our audiences, then are we not serving our audiences and our communities? So I was wondering if there seems to be something about this moment where we think that critical hope, solutions, constructive journalism is really important. And whoever wants to take that first.
So when I think about the impact of climate reporting, I really like to go back to like the local reporting sphere where I'm from. So I was trained at a local newspaper, and my whole family is from the city that I started my career as a journalist in. And when I think about that, then I have to think about my mom, who has a house in the city we live in, and she has to run it and take care of it by herself. And she's also taking care of my grandma. And I feel like when the local media is not accurately portraying what we need to do to fix and mitigate the situation, I can just imagine who we are failing. Because right now we are just often portraying the situation with fear. For example, in Germany over the summer, we had this discussion about how we need to regulate heating. And it was so fear-based, and it was so focused on like what politician had the most staggering quote. And instead of, for example, other European countries are already way further in this debate on how to have sustainable heating. And hardly any newsrooms, took the time to compare it and to take the emotion out of this reporting. And I can see who we're failing with that. Like the people who need to, invest in their homes, who need to make these decisions. And so that's why I feel like that critical hope and to see how it's manageable is really, really important right now.
Joy, Dana,
not to beat the kind of broken drum, but for me, it always goes back to those stats of the fact that there is a generation of youth who are growing up feeling that humanity is doomed and the future is frightening. They're the ones who are going to have to grow up and live with the impacts of the climate crisis. And of course, right now we are running out of time. Targets have been set for 2025, 2030, 2050 in order to live within a livable 1.5 degree pathway. The evidence has been pretty overwhelming that we're not on path, and I think if we continue to have that mentality driven by fear and anxiety that the future is doomed, that is very, very paralyzing, right? And if there is a belief that that the future, there is no hope and that we're going to give up on it, then of course nothing is going to change. So I think, of course, that critical hope is something that I hope to see more and more percolating back into the conversation. And Cristiana Figueres, her podcast, Outrage and Optimism, I think does a really excellent job. If anyone has listened to it or hasn't listened to it, highly recommend. But I think that also dance between anger or that kind of very visceral emotion that can be quite driving as a force, but coupled with this idea that anger can be channeled, or that emotion can be channeled into something, tangible. I think that's very, important. Give it all.
Dana, do you have, or you can ask one of us questions too if you had something else you wanted to dig into.
I mean, I think regarding what you said, what you asked, the way I see it is very short. I just think that with a click of a mouse, I am in charge, or we are in charge, my team is in charge of making sure that this content also reaches people's feeds. Like, we are in charge of that. Like, by every single click, every time we hit post or tweet or X or whatever it is, we are actively in charge of making sure that people get this type of content as well. And I just see it as, other than an honor, but also a great responsibility. So
Yeah, I mean, Noam Chomsky has a great quote, which is media manufactures consent. Let's say that again. Media manufactures consent. So if what we are manufacturing is fear and doom and unsolvability and apocalyptic sort of scenarios, then we're manufacturing a future and a present that's what people see, when in fact there are many communities around the world. I mean, Ope spoke about Lagos, Nigeria. Others have spoken about their own communities. There is no denial there. There cannot be doom there. You have to stave off the ocean. You have to do something. You have to be resistant to that change. And so we may be able to sit back, or I'll say I may be able to sit back as a white American and sort of be somewhat concerned philosophically with climate because it doesn't really affect me all that much. But in fact, I can't, because it is affecting the rest of, the world around me, both humans and every other living thing on Earth. Is there a question from you guys that you wanted to ask each other?
Yeah, I actually have a question to Joy about, so I'm wondering, do you portray, like, for example, the struggle to find solutions in your work? Let's say we do agree that we need to work towards, mitigating the situation, but there are different paths to that, and that's totally fine. Do you portray that in your work? And if so, how do you do that? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think also, as you so beautifully articulated it, we cannot just simply push out an endless rosy picture when the reality also around us is can be quite overwhelming. I think sometimes what it looks like, I mean, we did an explainer series in partnership with Bloomberg, called Spotlight, and it was 12 episodes. Every episode kind of looked at a different climate solution. I mean, looked at a different climate issue and then tried to point towards a climate solution. And that was a really interesting exercise, having 12 episodes looking at various different angles of water insecurity, food insecurity. What does a plastic recycling industry look like? What does, displacement look like? It was very much also, I think, a journey and exercise in that process of looking at solutions to tell our audience these solutions are not perfect, right? And sometimes even just call them a blanket statement as a solution can be a problem. But it is still the responsibility, I think, to be able to still lay out on the table, there are all these different options, there are all these different pathways that people are trying to figure out. So I think sometimes it's not just showing a perfect solution, it's saying, okay, this is being done and it's been done imperfectly. So pointing the finger to, okay, maybe more needs to be done in this area. I think that's kind of how we try to get around it.
So, Joe, do we have time for questions from the audience?
You've got one.
One or two? Okay.
Can I grab? Sweet.
Does anyone have a question for the panel? Yeah. Here you go. Maybe keep it brief and I'll try and kind of group a few together and then we'll just give them to the panel.
Thank you. My question is for Joy. First of all, I'm a big fan of Earthrise, so great work you're doing. I was just wondering if companies reach out to you very often towards your brand content branch, and what are your red lines regarding it?
It's a good question. Can I just get another question? Is there anything else from the audience? There's one back here, and then maybe I'll put them all to the panel. Okay. So red lines on partnerships, and then.
My name is Gabriela. I'm a journalist from Brazil. I was just wondering if you have ever measured or known any impact of solution-driven journalism within journalists, actually, not only audiences. As we see, journalists are very exhausted also of reporting like tough issues. Thank you.
That is an excellent question. I'll just bring the microphone back to the panel and then you can start answering those.
Sure, I'll answer the red line question. That is absolutely a favorite question for people to ask, and rightly so. The honest truth is, well, right now we're working on a kind of manifesto and a kind of like a criteria checklist, which we do not currently have. It has been very much just conversations that we hold within our team and reading through, I mean, of course, due diligence, been pouring through lots of sustainability reports. I mean, there's some obvious, this is absolutely a no, right? But then there are, of course, murkier ones, because as we see the shift of more and more organizations, more and more companies, cities, governments trying to push net zero climate targets, it becomes increasingly more difficult to discern what the intentions are or whether these plans are actually quite viable. So I don't have a great answer for you other than the fact that that's a process that we are internally building right now because it is extremely important. Yeah.
Great. And I'll take the, although Dana, I don't know if you have something you wanted to say on impact as well. So at Solutions Journalism Network, we're very focused on impact and supporting both newsrooms and journalists on helping them to actually create impact tracking, learn how to measure their impact, how to see what's really happening. And so on our website, we also have an impact tracker, so you can go and see like, this story was produced, this podcast came out, and then this thing happened. So for instance, we look at impacts of policy change, or if a policy ended up getting voted on, or did it end up getting voted down? So that's really important. We look at also internal practice change impacts. Are journalists more productive? Are we affecting the climate trauma and anxiety that's happening in our own profession in covering climate? So I think where we're trying to drive toward with our newsrooms is to say, when you're telling us your final grant report, we've given you money and now you have to tell us what you did with it, is I don't ask for any more page views or impressions or even time spent on page. I don't care about those metrics. Those are really poor proxies for what actually happens. So what we're looking for is, did something happen in the community? Did a community learn about a solution from another city or another country that they've adopted into their own place? We love to look at awards because that's also really helpful to see, like, the more that we see solutions journalism winning awards, the more that means the reward for doing solutions and constructive journalism inside of newsrooms is important. And right now, we still reward journalists for doing journalism the way we've always done journalism. So impact is really important, and I'm happy to talk after about how we support journalists on impact tracking as well. Dana, did you have any last things you wanted to say? I'll give you the last one. I'm not giving it to you, just take it. Last word.
No, I guess we really don't have much time, but I think, it's a bit easier for me because I work for a public broadcaster, meaning that it's, paid from the taxpayers' money. And so it is quite, I don't want to say easy, but it's not, it's quite frequent for us to see reports that we work on or share, or just interviews that are taking place in our studios that are later being discussed for better and worse, all the glitches later in the private talks, but for better and worse are later brought up to, the European Commission discussions, or later on, mostly government official or authorities, they would not necessarily spell out, for instance, because we read this and this at the New York Times, or because this and that investigation by the Washington Post. But it is kind of clear that many, many times these type of investigations or
publications, they lead to, some sort of like government or authority reaction. So it has happened more than once, twice, or 10 times that we found our reporting, especially in like solution journalism, making kind of like progress, or was seen later, taken by either German politicians or EU authorities. Hard to tell exact numbers, but one can always hope.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa, Dana, Joy. It's a pleasure. All right, back to you, Joe.